for our first assignment in Guatemala in 1987. It got so hard that we fell apart and ended up in the belly of a whale. We returned to the U.S. after less than a year of studying Spanish in Costa Rica and bringing our 2 little boys and our few remaining possessions to Guatemala. We were sent by our mission to a residential counseling center for missionaries. Vice President of Personnel for OC International came from the California Bay Area to meet with us at our temporary home at Link Care in Fresno. And as he was driving the 3 hours from his home to where we were staying, the Lord laid on his heart the story of Jonah. So as we sat in our crowded room, we lived in one room with our 2 little boys, Bill Kais read to us the entire book of Jonah and made it a story of second chances. He then told us how he believed that God wanted us to go back to Guatemala, and that if we would obey God, God would equip us to do the work that we had found so overwhelming. He told us that he believed that our struggles were part of God's way of preparing us for what we would someday do in Guatemala. It was very hard to believe in 1988 that God would ever use us in Guatemala.
And God used a friend of mine and I to come visit and pray with Susan and Memo, not knowing that it would take 15 years to get them out of their time of challenge.
You see, we wanted to obey God, and we believed in giving our lives for others, but once we arrived in Central America, we felt completely incapable of living up to the work. We weren't good enough, we weren't strong enough, we weren't steady enough to be able to weather the storm. Our intended 6-week stay at Link Care for some counseling and R&R turned into 15 years of what felt like the belly of a whale. But like Jonah, we knew that we had to complete the work that God had called us to do. We had many things happen that delayed our return to our Nineveh, but each year we wondered, is next year the year we're supposed to go back? We moved from California to Seattle in 1990 because Memo's mom had cancer. Then over the course of several years, we had 80 different people die in our family. And I was able to take care of most of them, and one by one, we were able to tell them about Jesus. These were all good reasons to stay in the U.S. We even were able to help our kids get a good education and help see them get married. I became a family nurse practitioner and got some really valuable medical experience to prepare me for being a better missionary. Memo taught middle school and Sunday school and helped at our church. So it wasn't all time spent waiting around for the next thing to happen. God was at work in us and through us during that time. Eventually we ran out of delay excuses. And 15 years after returning to the U.S. and hearing that Jonah story in our counseling center apartment, both of us were ready, and we packed up and we left for our Nineveh in Guatemala. Memo went to teach at a school for missionary kids, and I went along as the wife. My job was to be a prayer partner, support person, and use my medical training in some way. But I didn't know what I was going to do. I had already met some of the people in this church before we left for Guatemala, because between part 1 and part 2 of our missionary story, we formed Mono con Mono Health Reach as a short-term mission sending agency. We trained and led teams of medical and dental providers to do outreaches in poor areas of Latin America. And that's how I met Quinn and Sharon in Lee. They were on one of those teams, and they became key leaders in the Mono con Mono ministry after their very first trip. This church began to support the work we were doing and sent those 2 teams of volunteers to work alongside us and actually see the ministry in Guatemala. So after being in Guatemala for 6 weeks, God showed me what it was that I was supposed to do. And I volunteered to help a missionary nurse who had founded a clinic in a remote Mayan village. And while I was working there as a nurse practitioner, I noticed that many of the children didn't survive the first 2 years of their lives because of malnutrition. Mothers had no prenatal care, and it wasn't unusual for them to give birth to very small babies because they were so malnourished themselves, often weighing under 90 pounds as pregnant women. So we started a prenatal and nutrition program out of a villager's house.
In 2004, I came to visit my friend Bill, whom we know as Memo, and his wife Susan in Guatemala. It was just an introductory 2-week visit but it fostered a relationship that I had started with the Joneses 20 years earlier. I'd been praying, visiting them off and on, and since they had been missionaries in Guatemala Part 1, and this just brought the newsletters that I had seen, it brought them to life.
So over time, we felt called to build a ministry center in San Jose El Yalu. Through a series of events and miracles, a more than 3,000 square foot health, nutrition, and education center was built on a hill in Guatemala that was once a bean field. Farmers were trained in construction, and mothers were trained to cook hot, nutritious meals. And for over 5 years, hot lunches have been served 3 days a week to up to 300 mothers and children. Malnourished babies have grown to be healthy school children. Women who lived in despair have given their lives to Christ, and they have new skills to help keep their families healthy. We were able to start community health projects to build beds to keep kids who were dying of pneumonia up off the floor, stoves to keep smoke and pulmonary disease out of the homes, and also bathrooms so that in individual homes to help stop the spread of disease. In 2006, Memo's health began to fail, and in 2007, we had to get back to the U.S. And for the last 4.5 years, God has continued to sustain the ministry. He sent a series of 3 couples to step into our place to support the ministry, which is run by a Mayan staff. There's a Mayan doctor who is a medical and education director, a Mayan woman who heads up the nutrition staff, a Mayan builder who built that 3,000 square foot building, and he heads up all of the community health projects. And there are now 9 full-time staff who remain, and they are all original employees in Montecomana, Guatemala, and they continue to do an amazing job.
When Memo and Susan first had to leave Guatemala in 2007, God provided Brennan and Maria Jose Doyle, who stepped in for 3 years and added a youth group and women's Bible study. They networked with a local church to help bring more spiritual support to the struggling little church that was meeting in village member Lorenzo and Maria Juana's home. They also met Oscar Chiquito, a Guatemalan missionary with a vision for reaching all 7 villages around Yalu. And after praying for more than 5 years for a church to partner with Montecomana, Guatemala, the vision became a reality through that Los Olivos church in Sumpango, and it's actually the closest town to Yalu. Next was Greg and Kelly Brown. They also came for a year. Kelsey is a dietitian, completing her master's degree in public health, and Greg is a certified financial analyst. They improved the nutrition program administration and helped get an after-school homework club going in conjunction with the Los Olivos Church. Greg and Kelly are now in Chicago. Greg works for Boeing, and they're both getting their master's degrees, and they also serve on the board of Montecomana as secretary and treasurer, putting out the newsletters and handling all the finances. Alongside of Greg and Kelly's story in 2010, Memo had both beaten cancer for 2 years, and then in 1 week, he succumbed to leukemia. In the year that followed my friend Bill's death, my friendship with Susan began to change, and it changed again, as you heard this past June when we were married. And part of what attracted us to each other was a mutual interest in Guatemala and God's mission to reach the entire world. Lastly, this April, Barb and Jerry Norman from Ontario, Canada, who are in the handout that you have, they started serving as full-time missionaries from Montecomana, having visited Yalu for the first time on a short-term mission from their church in 2006. They felt the call of God in their lives, and they're now helping in a vision of starting different youth programs, improving the women's ministries, and starting men's ministries as well.
What was once just an idea to help malnourished women and children is now a very busy health, nutrition, and education center that is slowly transforming a village. It's our Nineveh. It took me 28 years from the time I said yes to God via Billy Graham's invitation to finally begin the work that God called me to do. There were many times that I felt like I was in the belly of a whale, wondering if I would ever be able to complete that Urbana promise. God has been gracious, just as he was gracious with Jonah, just as he was gracious to Nineveh. He's been gracious to us and to the people of Yalu. I wanted to do it. in the earlier service, we left out one of the passages, and I realized it's probably the passage that I need the most. It's Philippians 4:10. I rejoice greatly in the Lord that at last you have renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you have been concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I'm not saying this because I'm in need, for I have learned to be content in whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether being well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do everything through him who gives me strength. This church is part of the ongoing story of God's grace to a group of people. It has been several years since we've been able to come and tell you the stories. And in spite of Memo's illness and death and my life being completely remodeled, Seattle Community Church, Mono Kamano, and the people of Yalu remain tied together for an eternal purpose. Just as you have been an encouragement to us, we hope that we have been an encouragement to you today. Although it's always better to go to Nineveh directly, sometimes God gets us there the long way. And he sometimes uses painful circumstances and our own failures to get us to our final destination. I hope that for each one of us, we'll eventually answer the call of God on our lives and go to Nineveh, whether it's to a foreign country or right here in Seattle. May we be a people that both listens and obeys God's highest calling in our lives.
We'd like to close with Ephesians 3:17b through 21, and it says, "And I pray that you, being rooted and established in love, may have power together with all the saints to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ, and to know that this love surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled to the measure of all the fullness of God. Now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we can ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us. To him be the glory in the church and in Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever."